We live in an age of unprecedented deception, where the say-so of the mainstream narrative and the big players on the world stage seems to become de facto truth in the minds of most people. And in this context, it's really important to remind ourselves of another of the great deceptions, and that is this whole climate emergency story. And I don't think anybody explains the facts better than Dr. Patrick Moore. So I just wanted to show you this presentation by Patrick Moore, which clearly sets out a lot of the facts of reality that destroy the mainstream narrative on the dangers of carbon dioxide. So I hope you enjoy it and hope you find it informative.
Well, of course, we have to be very concerned about climate change and global warming in Canada, seeing as though we are the coldest country of all 198 countries in the world. This is a true fact. The average temperature of Canada is minus 5.35 Celsius. The reason we're colder than Russia on average is because we have the Arctic islands, and they have an ocean up there which doesn't count as land. So our country has a lower temperature on average than Russia even. And we're worried about warming. Apparently they're worried about it in Sweden too. As you can see, they're down there at around 190. Are they worried about climate change in India? Are they worried about climate change in Brazil? Are they worried about climate change in Nigeria, like on the equator where it's hot? No. They are not. And they're not doing anything about it because they don't believe it's a problem. And yet the people in the coldest countries in the world believe that some warming would be a problem. Like not just a problem, but an emergency, a crisis, a catastrophe. We must fight that with all our might. This graph, like I'm going to show you a bunch of stuff now, which is unfortunately a lot of it's in graph form, but at least that's better than just words, because a picture is a graph is a picture. This shows that through the 570 million year history of the Earth's climate and CO2, the temperature has basically just been up and down. Up during the greenhouse ages and down during the ice ages. CO2, on the other hand, the green line, has been a steady down. This is not a cause-effect relationship. There's no way that you can describe this as CO2 causing the temperature. There's so many places there. Look at the 146 million year point where one goes up, the other goes down, the other goes up, the other goes down. It's just not in sync enough to be described as a long-term cause-effect situation. That is the fundamental lie in the narrative of CO2 being the control knob of the Earth's temperature. Now you see the part where in the tertiary there on the right-hand side it goes up as high as it has been basically in the history of the Earth. This graph shows from there on down. We are at the end of a 50 million year cooling period on planet Earth. During that part at the beginning there, the Earth was entirely ice-free. As a matter of fact, it had been for 275 million years since the previous ice age, which you can see there at 290 million years ago. There has not been an ice age between then and now. The Earth was warmer the entire time for 275 million years. And that ice age, the Karoo, lasted for at least 50 million years. The one we're in now, which is shown at the tail end on the right side of this 50 million year cooling period, has only lasted for 2.6 million years. We are still in the Pleistocene Ice Age. This is another one of the lies in the narrative that the Ice Age is over. We have no reason to believe that. Here is the last 5.5 million years. As you can see, there is fairly good evidence there that we are still descending into the Pleistocene Ice Age. And one of the most interesting things about it is that for the first 1.5 million years, the ice ages were in a 41,000-year cycle, which is the cycle of the tilt of the Earth changing back and forth. And then it suddenly changed to a 100,000-year cycle 1 million years ago, which is the variation in the shape of the orbit of the Earth. These cycles are caused by the large gas planets, Jupiter and Saturn, being in different places and pulling on the Earth and on its tilt and making these cycles change. Milankovitch was an astronomer in the 20s, discovered these cycles. They weren't recognized until the 70s by the mainstream of science, but they are recognized today. Here's the last 350,000 years or so from ice cores from Antarctica, showing the 100,000-year cycles, the high points being the interglacial periods, like the one we're in now on the very far right hand. But as you can see, the previous interglacial periods were actually warmer than this one. That's because we are still declining into the Pleistocene Ice Age, temperature-wise. And as you can also see, the lower temperatures and the CO2, which is in blue, went down to the lowest they've been during the Pleistocene Ice Age in that same period. What you can say out of this is that today we are in a temperature on the Earth that is lower than it's been during this glacial period for the last 275 million years, and in a period where the CO2 is lower than it has been in the history of the Earth. As you saw in this slide, CO2 has done nothing but go down over the history of the Earth and reached its lowest point at the height of the last major glaciation, which is where it gets lowest on that graph on the right-hand side. So CO2 is lower and temperature is lower than it has been in the case of CO2 forever, and in the case of temperature for 250 million years, and they say it's too hot and there's too much CO2. This is the last 10,000 years during the interglacial period that we're in now. As you can see, it was warmer, the top black curve. It was warmer in the first part of this 10,000 year period than it is now. That the little ice age, shown on the very far right, is the coldest it's been for 10,000 years. And that CO2 in the meanwhile has gone up. This is called the Holocene conundrum. Because if CO2 goes up while temperature goes down, it's the exact opposite of what they are saying should happen. So there is, just in these slides I've shown you, there is ample evidence to demonstrate that the narrative that CO2 is the main control of global temperature is false. And going from this side, where you can see on the bottom there the two periods, the Holocene climatic optimum and the neoglacial, that means new glacial period. Here is a chart of the advances of the glaciers during the Holocene interglacial period. You can see there that at the Little Ice Age, which is the highest bars on the right-hand side, the glaciers have advanced further during the Little Ice Age just 300 years ago than they had done since we entered the Holocene interglacial period coming out of the last major glaciation. This means that we are already embarked upon the gradual descent as occurred here into the next major glaciation. Do you see what I mean? 5,000 years already into the gradual descent into the next major glaciation. That is what the data shows us. And the data shows us, yes, they say the glaciers are receding now, and they have been just for the last 300 million years, which you can see on the very far right of this. This is the modern warm period. In these large swings of temperature from Roman warm period to medieval warm period to modern warm period, there are little ups and downs all along the way. Again, you can see that here, all the little ups and downs along the way. Whereas they're generally warming and generally cooling, there's still little ups and downs. We are in a little up right now, but it is still colder now than it was 8,000 years ago. This is the difference between an active sun and a quiet sun. The sun went quiet a few years ago. There is a lag in effect because of the ocean taking a long time to change temperature, etc. But people have been predicting, people I trust, have been predicting for a long time now that this quiet sun would be one of the little downs in this generally warming modern period. And what do we see? Already this winter, last winter, the winter before, the trend has begun in that direction. I'm not one to predict next year, never mind 100 years from now, because as a scientist I know that's impossible. But there is definitely a certain degree of evidence that the situation is moving in that direction. And I understand that crops in the prairies this year at higher latitudes are not doing as well as they did during the warmer periods in past decades. I want to show you the y-axis effect. As you know, the x-axis is along the bottom in a graph, and the y-axis is along the side, the vertical axis. It looks like temperature has really increased a lot in this graph. This is a real graph of how much temperature has increased since 1860. Note, though, that the y-axis is only 1.2 degrees Celsius. That's not a very big increase. Here's the same data on a graph with the y-axis showing a normal range of temperatures on the Earth, from -10 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit, or minus 23 C to 43 C. That's not much of an increase in temperature when you look at it that way. And that's what's happened since 1860. Always look at the y-axis. Extreme weather events. This is global hurricanes, both frequency and intensity. Intensity going up a teeny bit, frequency coming down even more. It should be expected that in a warmer world, because hurricanes and tornadoes are created by differences in temperature between cold and warm air, and the reason 90% of all the tornadoes in the world are in the prairies, mainly down in the States, is because there is no mountains between the Gulf of Mexico and the North Pole. It's flat the whole way up the Great Plains, the former sea. So the hot and cold air can meet each other all the time there and cause those hurricanes. The same thing happens in the ocean. But as the world warms, it warms inordinately towards the poles. When the world warms, the equator stays relatively equal. It's the poles where the warming occurs to make the Earth's average temperature much higher. So the difference between the polar temperature and the equatorial temperature is much less in a warmer world, and therefore you would expect fewer large hurricanes and tornadoes. This is U.S. landfalling hurricanes by category and decade from 1851. An honest person would say there really isn't much of a trend there. And there really isn't much of a trend there, because that temperature hasn't changed that much, for one thing. Here's global weather-related disaster losses. From 1990, it's gone down an incredible amount. That's because of early warning systems and satellites and harder infrastructure where people's homes are more protected against bad weather conditions. And this is only going to get better as we move forward. There is no increase in destruction by major weather events. Annual count of strong to violent tornadoes, 1954 through 2012, indicating perhaps that a very slight warming is having a very slight effect on the frequency. U.S. forest area burned, 1926 to 2017. The warmists always start at 1984 and make it look like it's increased over the last years. But actually, it was in this period of low fire in the middle that the U.S. Forest Service started managing forests on public lands in particular to prevent forest fires. Then the Greens got control of the Forest Service and started unmanaging the forests, what you could call mismanaging the forests by not intervening and reducing fuel load and all the other things that cause these massive wildfires. And wildfires have gone up in the last 2 decades as a result of their opinions on the subject. In other words, professional foresters have been overruled by green ideologues on the management of public forest lands in the United States. The 6th mass extinction. The 6th mass extinction is fake. There is no 6th mass extinction. It's another one of those invisible fake catastrophes. You ask someone to name what was the last species that went extinct in the mass extinction, and they can't name one. But look at this graph. This is from 1999, February, in the National Geographic. It's the reason I quit my lifetime subscription to that, what is now science porn rag. At the beginning of that graph is when life began to proliferate as multicellular organisms, the Cambrian explosion of life, really the beginning of modern life on Earth. Life had been there for 3 billion years, but it was all microscopic, single-celled, and confined to the sea. Not a very interesting time. Then came the Cambrian explosion of modern life, and look at this graph. This graph shows the number of families of life. It goes families, genus, species. So families is a fairly high order, like the ape family, of which we are proud members, the cat family, the dog family, the weasel family, you get it. Up goes biodiversity right off the bat. Then there's an extinction. Up it goes again, another extinction. It gets back up to where it was before. The Permian extinction, where 90% of all species went extinct. Up it goes again. Then number 5, on the far right, not the very far right, but the second one, that's the dinosaur extinction. So not that many families went extinct, but many species did. All the dinosaurs, even the marine dinosaurs in particular. Then up it goes again. Today, biodiversity on this earth in numbers of species and families is higher than it has been in the history of life. This is the power of evolutionary biology, the power of life to proliferate and to expand and to differentiate. It's a miracle, and we live in it. But look at the very end of that with the little square around it, the little red square around it. You can see there's a downturn there. That is the 6th mass extinction. But note that the line turns fuzzy there. I don't know if you can see that on this slide, but it does. The line is a solid line right until where it goes down, and then it turns fuzzy. And down below in the square there, the red square, it said, scientists are warning that species are going extinct of amphibians, insects, large mammals, and birds. Like they're talking about families of species here. No family of species has gone extinct since the dinosaur extinction. Not one. Yet they put a downtick there. I wrote to National Geographic. I said, why does the line turn fuzzy? To the editors of it. They came back and did not answer that question. But I said, does that mean that there's no known families of amphibians, birds, large mammals, and insects that have gone extinct? They said, well, actually, scientists believe that this will certainly happen, the 6th great extinction. That was their answer. In other words, it hasn't happened yet. Yet it says present at the bottom of that slide, as if that downtick means that some families of life have gone extinct. That is why I canceled my subscription. Because here is the actual graph of red list species that have gone extinct since 1870. Why has species extinction declined? Two reasons. First, when Europeans, beginning in 1500, colonized all the islands in the Pacific and the Atlantic, and Australia and New Zealand included as big islands, there was a pulse of extinctions because Europeans brought predators and diseases that those species on those islands were not used to, and they became extinct as a result. But that has ended now almost completely, because all the ones that were vulnerable have already gone extinct. But the second reason was because about 100 years ago, human beings became concerned about species extinction. We are the only species on Earth that cares about the extinction of other species. The only one. Now, when any species is recognized as being endangered, we make a species recovery program to make sure they don't become endangered. What other species does that? Not one of the 1.6 million other known species on Earth does that. And yet we are blamed for the 6th mass extinction. Polar bears will become extinct due to warming and ice loss. We have been told for how many decades now? How many of you know how many polar bears there are? See, if you have read enough to know they think they know how many polar bears there are, that's great. But how many people can go to the Arctic and count the polar bears? Because they're not invisible like CO2 or whatever makes GMOs poisonous or radiation or all the other invisible fake catastrophes. Polar bears are quite visible. But how many people can go up there and count them? Well, there are some people who know how to count them. They're called the Inuit. And I'll get to that in a minute. This is what climate change looks like. Now I know why I canceled my subscription. This is a starving old bear, probably with no teeth, having lived a good life, but they don't have old folks' homes for polar bears. They die out there in the cold and in the wild. I guess a fitting death for a wild animal. But how many of you know about the treaty that was signed in 1973 to prevent and to end unrestricted hunting of polar bears? How many of you know that? 1, 2, 3 maybe. Why don't you know that? Because the media has never reported it in this modern era of concern for polar bears. In 1973, every circumpolar country, Norway, Russia, Canada, the United States in particular, signed a treaty ending the unrestricted hunting of polar bears in the Arctic. Since then, the population has grown from somewhere around 6,000 to between 22 and 31,000 polar bears. And that's why you don't hear all that much about this anymore, because this is becoming known. There's the facts. Polar bears are not a distinct species. They are a variety of grizzly bear, otherwise known as the European brown bear, which came across the land bridge with humans 15,000 years ago during the peak of the last glaciation when the sea was 400 feet lower than it is today. This shows that the polar bear lived through 2 warmer interglacial periods than the one we have today, because it had evolved about 400,000 years ago because of ice. Because the ice came to the Arctic, it made sense to be white if you were going to hunt. But they can breed with grizzly bears and produce viable offspring, which is basically the definition of a species. The Arctic ice is disappearing, of course. Here's a picture of the North Pole from satellite in April of this year. Does it look like the ice is disappearing? They tell us basically that the more ice there is, the more polar bears there will be, because then there's more habitat for them to hunt their favorite prey, the seal. No, no, no. If the Arctic Sea is completely covered in ice, how can plankton grow? The sun can't reach the sea to grow the plankton. If plankton can't grow, how can fish grow? If fish can't grow, how can seals grow? If seals can't grow, how can polar bears live? There's a balance between the amount of open ocean there needs to be and the amount of ice there needs to be. So the idea having more ice makes more polar bears is entirely false. And that is why polar bears thrived through these periods, because there was still enough ice for them. Here's another lovely picture. This is what the kids are shown. This is truly what happened to Arctic ice over the last while. It's gone down and up and down. But the alarmists like to start from where it was at its peak in 1979 and went down to today. It was actually higher. Amundsen went through the Northwest Passage in a 16-foot boat with a 6-horsepower engine in 1904 to 1906. So it was obviously open at that time. These are the lies we're told. Here's the last 10 years of ice cover in Antarctica from winter to summer. It is not in a precipitous decline, but this is the real news. A year ago, the government of Nunavut, the Inuit people, tabled a report which has now been tabled with affidavits with the federal government in Ottawa, saying there are too many polar bears. They are killing people. They are invading their homes. They used to control polar bears in the old days, but now they don't. They take a few big game hunters up there from the States and some from Canada, I guess, to kill a polar bear or two, but they have a very small quota. So despite this, even with this small quota, the polar bear population continues to grow. So be it. But that's why you don't hear much about this right now. Carbon dioxide fertilization is greening the earth. NASA and NOAA are not one-dimensional organizations. They have departments. One department says CO2 is the control knob of climate. The other department is saying, and same with National Oceanic Atmospheric Association, that CO2 is a fertilizer for the earth and is causing the greening of this planet all around it. This is the Australian work. Since 1984, they've been measuring the chlorophyll from satellites and showing that in the driest areas, the greening is higher than it is even in the wet areas. Why? Because CO2 is not only a necessary food for plants, which was at low levels for plants before we started emitting it in large volumes, it also makes plants more efficient with water. Therefore, they can grow in drier climates better than they could before. Because when CO2 is in higher concentration, the plants don't have to open up their pores under their leaves as much to get enough CO2. So they can now get enough CO2 with a constricted opening in their pores, and therefore less water escapes as a result. It's a two-way street there. That's why you see the most greening in Western Australia, Western India, across Sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel, in the Great Plains of North America where it's dry. This is the Sahara Desert from 14,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago, in keeping with that division in the Holocene of the climate optimum and the neoglacial period. The Sahara Desert was covered in vegetation up until about 6,000 years ago. Goat herders and sheep herders and cattle herders were all across it, and all those red dots are towns. Suddenly, 5,000 years ago, the climate shift happened and the Sahara dried out. People moved into the Nile Valley and the Egyptian civilization began. It may be there's a connection there between the concentration of people occurring, the city-states, and the Egyptian civilization. A warmer world would be a wetter world. That's because when the world is warmer, it evaporates more water from the oceans and causes more rainfall on the land. Where I come from, where it rains 150 inches a year on northern Vancouver Island, we don't need any wetter. But there's a lot of places in this world that do, a lot more than don't. Interestingly, China and India dominate the greening of the earth, largely due to their massive reforestation efforts that have occurred over the last 3 decades. China and India have added more new forest on deforested lands that were previously deforested largely for grazing and agriculture, because modern farming methods have made it possible to grow way more food on less land. They're able to put forests back where they used to be and cause this massive greening. This just proves that CO2 increase on the right is 2 times what's in the air today, plus 450 ppm from what's in the air today. Trees grow 3 to 4 times as fast. Almost every wild plant out there that is getting enough water and nutrients, the limiting factor on its growth is CO2, even today. Plants prefer between 800 and 1,500, even up to 2,000 ppm for optimum growth. That is why every commercial greenhouse grower in the world adds CO2 to their greenhouse to get 20 to 80% increased productivity and growth, and they pay for that CO2. If they didn't have to pay for it, they'd put it up to 3,000. There's a law of diminishing returns on the economies of buying it. But at 3,000, plants grow faster than they do at lower levels. So we got a totally misguided situation going on here in governments, especially in the West, around this world, believing that CO2 is negative when there's no negative and only positive. Where the carbon is. This is a schematic of the global carbon cycle. In the red, it's going up and coming down, cycling. In the blue, it's how much carbon there is there at one time. The atmosphere, as you can see, contains 850 billion tons of carbon. But the oceans include about 45 times as much carbon as the atmosphere. So when the oceans lose CO2, say 1%, it causes a 45% increase in atmospheric CO2. That's where those CO2 and temperature lines are in sync during the glaciations and interglacial periods. When oceans warm, they put CO2 out. When oceans cool, they suck CO2 down. Note the fossil fuels that we know about have between 5,000 and 10,000 billion tons of carbon in them. And that we are putting out on the far left there 10 billion tons per year. Now some people are saying that because plants respiration is putting out 113 and soil respiration is putting out 58, much bigger numbers, that therefore our CO2 is very small compared to the cycles of nature. This is confusing cash flow with balance sheet. The cycles of nature are up and down. Our CO2 emissions from fossil fuels go up, but coal plants don't suck them back down. So our CO2 is a net addition, whereas the other cycles are in a cycle. 100 goes up, 100 comes down. 100 goes up, 100 comes down. Ours is 10 goes up, 10 doesn't come down. That's why the atmosphere has increased from 750 to 850 billion tons due to human emissions. But look at the red circle. The Earth's crust contains 100 million billion tons of carbon. So much bigger a number than all the others. And that made me wonder, how did that carbon get in the Earth's crust? Did that have anything to do with the green line here? And then I thought, yeah, that carbon in the Earth's crust is all carbonaceous rocks, which is calcium carbonate in the form of chalk, limestone, marble, and dolomite, all of life origin, all from calcareous marine species creating armor plating for themselves from calcium and carbon dioxide in the sea. Armor plating, a very useful thing when you have a little soft body that everything wants to eat. Just like a knight in armor. Marine species of all kinds of types. Look at the list there. Coccolithophores on the upper left. Microscopic phytoplankton. Plants, the basis of the food chain in the sea. Beautiful too. Shellfish, starfish, the echinoderms. Foraminifera on the bottom right are animals. Those holes in the webbing fit perfectly with a coccolithophore, the plant. So the foraminifera are next up in the food chain. They graze through giant floods of these coccolithophores, and they take them in and eat them, and then something else eats them. Coral reefs are probably about 50% of all the calcium carbonate that's been dropped to the bottom of the ocean and turned into calcium carbonate sediments, limestone. And the shellfish like crustaceans, crabs, lobsters, shrimp. Look at all the different shellfish there are. Sand dollars, oysters, mussels. All of these are taking calcium and carbon dioxide from the ocean and turning it into shells, almost all of which ends up as sediment and is lost to the global carbon cycle. That is why this green line goes down. They didn't mean to do this, but inadvertently they presaged the end of life on Earth. Because when CO2 gets below 150 ppm in the atmosphere, all the plants start to die. And it got down to 180 during the last major glaciation as the seas sucked it up, getting colder. Oh, was I here? Anyways, the sand dollars, the oysters, and the mussels. And there's the White Cliffs of Dover. What are they made of? Coccolithophores. Quite a few of them, because they're microscopic. And it's a huge area of sediment. And here is a limestone quarry. The Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, made of limestone. The limestone caves of Chile. The cathedrals of Italy, made with marble. All of this was created by life, and all of it amounted to carbon dioxide being taken from the global carbon cycle and put on the bottom of the ocean. Here's the projected CO2 level in the absence of human emissions in the blue line going down. At the present era, it is 180. It was 180 during the last glaciation. We have no reason to believe the next glaciation isn't coming. Will it go down to 170 at that time? 160 the next time? 150 the next time? We don't know exactly, but it's still going down until we came along. Our CO2 emissions have reversed the 150 million year decline in CO2 and restored a balance to the global carbon cycle. We are life's salvation, not its destroyer. I first presented this hypothesis 5 years ago in London at the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, surrounded by 10 Downing Street and the Parliament and all these other institutions that have been around for hundreds of years. I've given it at least 100 times since. No one has challenged me on this hypothesis. The warmists won't touch it, because I think they know it's true. Just like the $100,000 US wager I put up after the Paris Agreement was signed, that I would bet anybody in the world, 100,000 US dollars, that CO2 emissions will be higher in 2025 than they were in 2015. Not one warmist will take that wager. They do not believe their own BS. They do not believe that the Paris Agreement will work. It's all fake. And that's why we shouldn't have anything to do with it. Fossil fuels are 100% organic. The word organic used in farming and food is a marketing term. It is not a scientific or technical term. In science, organic means organic chemistry, the chemistry of carbon. The carbon is the chemistry of life. All other chemistry is inorganic chemistry. All the fossil fuels were produced by solar energy in ancient forests and seas. They are the product of renewable energy. When burned, their main products are CO2 and H2O, the two main ingredients for photosynthesis, the production of sugar, and all the energy for all life on Earth. They are the largest storage battery of solar energy on the Earth, and always will be as far as I know. Just a little trip through energy density. You'll see diesel at the top. Diesel fuel has the highest energy intensity of any energy fuel we have. Go down to the bottom and you'll see propane, and way over to the side there, different things, but there it is. Those are mostly biofuels and fossil fuels. That is why we use gasoline and biodiesel and diesel and LNG and propane, going down to coal and methanol and corn. All those work. But look at this. This is done by Toyota. They make electric cars too. The batteries, in terms of energy density, compared with hydrogen, compressed natural gas, ethanol, and there's gasoline and diesel fuel. That's why we will never have a full-blown electric car economy. And they're still only talking about cars. If you ban fossil fuels in this world, how are the tractors going to run? On batteries? The big combines? The big tractors all around the world? No. How are the trucks that take 40 tons of food into the cities, 500 cities, over 1 million people? How are those trucks going to get the food into the cities? They going to use horses again? If we ban fossil fuels, the death toll, like they're saying to me, I say, well, about Greta Thunberg, they say, well, she's not recommending mass extinction or of people or, mass death, like Stalin and Mao and Hitler did. They used children too for their programs. And I'm going, are you kidding me? If we ban all the fossil fuels, no tractors and no trucks, in the middle of every one of those 500 cities with 1 million people, the people would start to die in the center. And it would work its way out. And they were talking about eating people here this morning. I heard that. Well, guess what would happen if the people started starving from the middle of the cities out? And pretty soon, all there'd be left is a few peasants trying to grow enough food for what population was left in this world. And that is a fact. So Greta Thunberg and AOC and the Green New Deal and Justin Trudeau are all presaging a world like that, as if that would be better than a world with fossil fuels. And we better recognize that as a society and as a humanity around this planet. Comparing one nuclear power plant's footprint to the same amount of energy from solar farms and offshore wind farms, and they don't produce reliable energy either. So why wouldn't you build more nuclear plants? Because the Greens have scared everybody into thinking they're scary. Nuclear power has the least deaths per unit energy produced of any electricity technology. And look what we could do with nuclear energy and save some fossil fuels for the future. There's 6 countries with nuclear navies. There's 4 with nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. There's 6 countries with nuclear submarines, 4 with nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Russia has a fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers. The nuclear ship Savannah was a nuclear-powered cargo ship. There is no reason why all shipping could not be nuclear powered. No reason whatsoever. And that would save some oil for the cars and trucks and tractors into the future. Here's my final information slide. Canada's coal consumption is 0.7% of China's. China's annual increase in coal use is nearly 3 times Canada's total use. China is under no obligation to reduce its coal use. Canada plans to eliminate coal. That tells us something, doesn't it? If you in Alberta shut down your coal plants, I'll be very ashamed of you. Please leave those coal plants running. They're perfectly good electricity producers. They're as clean as a whistle compared to what they used to be in this world, and they're low cost. If you replace those coal plants with wind and solar, you will suffer the same fate as Ontario and Germany have suffered. So, to conclude, we have 2 choices. Save Canada, quit Paris, build pipelines. Save Alberta, quit Canada, build pipelines. Thank you very much. Thank you.